Hello, my name is Ailish O'Hora and welcome to our General Data Protection and Regulation podcast ahead of the imminent introduction of new European rules. As many of you will know, failure to comply with the regulations which come into place in May can result in penalties costing millions of euros, as well as other headaches for business owners and organisations. But there seems to be a lot of fear out there, and here to dispel some of that is Daragh O'Brien of Castlebridge, the Data Governance and Privacy Specialist. First of all, can you explain what GDPR is and what are its implications for businesses and organisations?
Okay, for anyone who hasn't found out about this yet, GDPR is a European regulation, which means it has direct effect, and it's an update to the existing data protection legislation that we've had for 30 years at this stage. The GDPR builds on the core principles of the existing legislation. It enhances and extends some rights that individuals have, but also it clarifies some of the obligations on organisations that are processing data about people in terms of the types of controls, governance, etc. they need to put in place around that information. And also it introduces some interestingly large penalties, which everyone's focusing on, 4% of turnover or 20 million euro for serious offences, or 10 million euro or 2% of turnover for less serious offences. But it's worth bearing in mind within that there is also a whole range of enforcement sanctions the Data Protection Commissioner will have available to her that don't come to the level of a full financial penalty, and many of those are powers that they already have today.
And is it fair to say that there's a lot of fear around the regulation that may not be necessary?
Yes. One thing we encounter with organisations is that they're now opening the Sunday Independent and they're seeing headlines about GDPR, and they're hearing it being mentioned on podcasts like this or on Sunday morning news shows, and they're GDPR, what's happening? And as a result, they're starting to panic because they don't understand, they're not aware, they're not sure, and they're not sure how ready they are. Also, there's this myth of compliance. The Belgian Data Protection Authority actually came out last month and said that they themselves were not going to be compliant with GDPR by the 25th of May, which is the date the legislation comes into force and is enforceable from, because it's a risk-based model. So the Belgian Data Protection Authority said they weren't going to be compliant because there was lots of stuff they still needed to do themselves, but also they doubted whether anyone could be fully compliant in the context of a risk-based approach, because it means you have to have constant vigilance and be alert on a day-to-day basis to what's happening with data in your organisation. And the worst thing you could do is say, we're fully compliant on a Monday, because I guarantee you on Tuesday morning, someone somewhere in your organisation will have done something stupid and will put you on the wrong side of the law again.
And how would you advise businesses and organisations to ensure that person doesn't do something stupid?
Well, it's all about raising your internal awareness in the organisation about what data you have about people. So the GDPR applies to data about people who are living. So it's anything about names, addresses, phone numbers, IP addresses, social media identifiers, CCTV, audio recordings. All of those things fall under the remit of GDPR. Be aware of what information you have. Be aware of why you have it. Be aware of why you're using it. But also make sure you've told people what you're using it for and how you're getting it. One of the common myths that exists around GDPR is that everything's going to require consent. That's actually not the case. Under GDPR, there are changes to the rules around consent to tighten it up, to require people to get more specific and more unambiguous consent. But that only applies where consent is the only basis for your processing, and it's worth looking at what you're doing in your organisation to figure out why you have the data and what grounds, what basis you're relying on for processing that data. Is it by consent, or do you need to have that information to execute or deliver on a contract? Or is it in the legitimate interests of your organisation to have that data? For example, CCTV cameras for security purposes will be in the legitimate interests of an organisation to have, but you need to do a balancing test to make sure that you're clear as to where your interests stop and the rights of the individual begin.
Daragh O'Brien is one of the speakers at the DataSec conference on April the 9th at the RDS. Issues that will be addressed include data storage and retention, everything you need to know about GDPR, accountability, implementation and response, as well as employee rights and privacy in the workplace. The keynote speaker is Data Protection Commissioner Helen Dixon. For more information and to get tickets for the event, go to www.independent.ie/datasec.